Hey everyone, welcome to Watch It Played Table Talk. My name is Rodney Smith and this is
Pat McDonald.
And in this weekly segment, we take a gaming-related topic, share our initial thoughts on it, invite your responses through the YouTube comments and your own videos that we'll compile into next week's Table Talk Back episode, and that way we can all participate in the conversation.
And in this episode, we're going to look at what to expect when attending a tournament, whether it's formal or maybe a little informal.
Yeah, this one was on my mind because I recently attended the Ashes weekend, which was the largest tournament held for Ashes so far. It was the launch of the first expansion. And I hadn't actually intended to play in the tournament at all, but I was encouraged to, and I kind of got excited by the idea, so I did. So that's kind of fresh on my mind. I just wanted to share my experience and also some thoughts I had. And I know you've played in a bunch of tournaments.
Yeah, nothing recently, but yeah, I used to play quite a bit of Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! And a few other things here and there.
Okay, let's dive into this topic then a bit. One question that might be worth answering is why even have a tournament at all, right? Because, I mean, we can just get together in our game groups and play games. Why escalate it to something more formal? I suppose one of the reasons is because it helps sort of foster the community around the game. It gets gamers into the retail store, because a lot of tournaments are held in retail shops, right?
Yeah,
and
true.
the retailers like that, because then maybe you're in there, you're buying other product, or you're buying more of that product. And if you're playing a game, maybe not doing so well, it might inspire you to buy a few more to maybe make your deck better or whatever, right?
Yeah, and a lot of the smaller retail stores especially will offer some sort of a small cash prize or even store credit for the winners.
Right.
So it's just another incentive to shop at the store. And then, of course, you get into the bigger tournaments where you're qualifying for something, whether it's, a Grand Prix or regionals or nationals or even like a world championship.
Right.
And some games will have huge cash prizes, $10,000, $5,000, $25,000 for the winner.
Quite an incentive.
Yeah,
Wow.
I mean, we're not talking millionaire poker stars or anything,
Right.
but we're up there.
But on a lot of levels, it's starting to approach that kind of fervor with some of these more popular games. Many games are starting to get these organized play kits that companies are making to support their games and to support the retailers having some kind of organized event, even beyond the traditional, you think of card games, but into the board games as well. Like Splendor has like an organized play kit. This is something a lot of different publishers are really focusing on because I think they see the value in growing the scene for their games, because the more people playing, the more people are telling other people about playing, and competition does draw people to a game.
Yeah, it is a little strange for me, the idea of doing a tournament for any sort of game that isn't a two-player game. Because I do understand that you could have a tournament setting where, 3 or 4 players are playing the same game at the same time, but it is a little strange for me.
Yeah.
Because there's just a
It's
lot
not what we
more
normally think of.
variables.
Yeah, we don't normally think of that. I know you and I ended up in a tournament for Lords of Waterdeep at Gen Con.
Yes.
And we ended up at the same table. It created a weird little dynamic because do we go after each other when there's other strangers at the table we could go after instead?
Yeah, and 2 of the guys at our table also knew each other.
Right, and they clearly stated out loud, well, I'm not going to attack my partner.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm going to have to attack you. And at that point, it was kind of like, well, okay, game on then. Well, as the person with the most experience of tournaments here, Pep, I thought maybe you could tell people what they can expect when they show up at a tournament, right?
There's lots of different things to expect. I mean, the first thing, you're going to have to bring whatever it is the tournament is with you, most likely.
Right.
Unless it's something that's pre-prepared.
Right, it could be like a deck of cards, for example, or tokens or dice or whatever it is.
Whatever you need. But we can talk about that a bit more later. But the idea is you're going to get in, you're going to need to register for the tournament, most likely.
Right.
Unless it's all been done ahead of time. You're going to need to likely make a deck list for whatever your deck is, if it's a deck-related game.
And why is
if it's
that?
a miniatures tournament. It's mostly to keep track of like cheating and stuff. Like you're supposed to come in with, let's say, a 60-card deck for Magic and a 15-card sideboard. You're not allowed to change that during the game, and it needs to be reset back to that at the start of each game. So technically, a player could call a judge if something seems amiss, and they will do random deck checks and things too during the game to see, does your deck actually match the deck list?
Yeah, that happened to me at the Ashes event, actually. I got called up for one of the random deck checks, and they went through everything to make sure it was legal. And they actually did come across someone who had an illegal deck there. Definitely did not seem to be intentional. It was a simple misunderstanding, a little mistake, right? But they found that. And it did cost that person that particular matchup. They weren't kicked out, but that counted as a loss for them, and then they could continue on. So that is important to make sure you have your deck right.
Yeah, definitely. And then they're gonna have tables set up with likely numbered seating. Whenever the first pairings come up, they'll either be on a screen or they'll be on paper, and they'll tell you what seat you need to go to, who you're facing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that basically gets you at the table and ready to start playing. I know at the Ashes tournament, they sort of ran down a few quick little rules for everyone, like how long each pairing was going to take you, how long you had to play your match, right?
Yeah.
And then if there would be a break, how long that would be, and so on.
Yeah, and every game will have different rules too, depending on certain factors about that, like what the time will be, what happens if you go over the time.
Right.
Usually it's best 2 out of 3. What happens if you tie 3 of your games?
Yes.
For example, and all games have different kind of ways to handle that.
I'd recommend if you are going to a tournament, be sure to look and see if the game has some specific tournament rules. I know for Ashes there was a tournament rule that related to if you became the first player, you got to choose who goes first. Whereas in the traditional game, it's if you had the most basic dice, then you went first. Okay, so this was a slight change that way, right? So you'll usually have some kind of document like that to inform you. It's worth looking that up and giving it a quick read through. Now, one thing we kind of touched on there, which I think maybe is important to focus on, is the pairing structure. How you end up getting paired up with somebody, what happens when you lose, and then you go to a second round. Who do you get matched up with then, and so on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so usually it'll be done Swiss. Most things will be done Swiss because that means everybody's going to be playing. The idea is everybody starts off as zeros.
Right.
You're just randomly paired with each other, and then the winners will get paired against the other winners, and the losers will get paired against the other losers.
Right.
And then it just keeps going from there. So after that, whoever's won games, like if people have won 2 games, now those people should be put against each other, and the people who won 1 game, there are going to be tiebreakers, and those will matter. So let's say, you are at the bottom tiebreaker of the 2-0, you might end up facing against the guy who has the highest tiebreakers on the 1 win, 1 loss.
Right. Depending on the number of players too, right? Like you might have an odd number of players as well. So
Yeah.
what happens when you have an odd number of players, actually?
You can't
pair everyone, right?
Yeah, you get a bye, so you just get to sit there and watch. The nice part is it does count as a win.
Oh, it's a freebie.
It's a free win.
Nice.
But in the tiebreaker standpoint, generally it'll always count as the worst possible tiebreakers because you haven't faced anyone. Because a lot of times your tiebreakers are going to be, it'll be different for every game, but a lot of times it will be something like how well the people that have beaten you have done. So if you lose in the first round to the guy, for example, who wins the entire tournament.
That happened to me during Ashes,
Yeah. You are going to have some of the best tiebreakers in the game because every good thing that happens to him kind of relates back to you.
Okay, right.
Usually.
Yes.
Again, it'll depend for every game. A more casual run tournament will probably be done by a guy with pen and paper, just kind of
Just
making
trying
it
to
up.
make things somewhat even, or right?
Yeah.
Typically, I think they do try, if there's an option, to avoid matching the same people up.
Oh yeah,
right?
you should never face the same person. And there are different kinds of tournament pairing formats too. Like single elimination is obvious. You play, you lose, you're done. You're kicked out.
Right.
You don't see that very often because, again, you don't get to be involved too often. Double elimination happens a little bit, though, where you get 2 losses before you're gone.
Right.
And that way everybody gets, that one chance at a failure. And that'll happen sometimes.
I think in the Ashes tournament, there was about 50 players, and we did 5 rounds until there was a top 8, and then everyone else was done, and the top 8 continued to play until there was like one final winner in that case, right?
Yeah, and a lot of times how many rounds you play will kind of depend on how many players show up too.
Right, exactly.
Like with less players, you might only do 4 rounds, but if you get, like 200 players, it might be something like 8 rounds before you go to top 8.
You can narrow it down to a top
Yeah,
group.
it helps narrow it down. And then the top 8 goes to single elimination. So once you're in the top 8, you would play, a game with someone. You lose, you're just out of the tournament now.
You mentioned also about tiebreaker rules. I think it is important to remind people to look into that again, see what the tournament rules are. For example, in Ashes, you collect blood points. Simply, the amount of damage you do to your opponent, even if you don't win, will count as blood points to help you break ties. So if you realize you're going to lose a match, you might go, well, if I play this way, I can get more damage in, so I'll just try to do that. So it improves my chances of breaking a tie later. So just know the game that you're playing and how those rules work.
Yeah, every game is going to be different.
Now, we did touch on things to bring with you, like the deck or tokens or dice, whatever you need to play. But sometimes there's other things that you wouldn't think of, like what about food and snacks? Like, is that allowed at a tournament?
You'd probably want to check whenever you go to
Right.
the tournament whether they're okay with it being like out and around the stuff, the cards and everything. But it's something you probably should have with you. Like make a plan for lunch, make a plan for supper.
Because it can be a long day, like a tournament with 5 rounds, and if you go beyond that, it could be many hours, 5, 6, 7 hours of playing, right?
Bigger tournaments are actually weekend events.
Sure,
Like the Grand
yeah.
Prix are 2-day events. So I mean, if you think you're going to be there the whole time, you want to make sure you have the stuff you need.
And take bathroom breaks regularly. You don't want to be in the middle of a game and you use the bathroom.
Yeah,
not saying it happened to me or anything, but
manage your time whenever you have that free
that's
time.
right.
But something you kind of want to think about too is just how much space you're taking up. Because there's
right.
only so much space available, and you really, in my opinion, don't want to have anything on the table that isn't related. And you want to make sure that you have maybe one small bag or a briefcase or something that that you can keep beside you. But other than that, you don't want to have a couple bags. And just imagine if everybody at a tournament you went to had a suitcase with them.
Right.
Like how
And
ridiculous
snacks
would
and
that
food
look?
and water bottles and
Yeah.
deck boxes and this is a game I'm going to play later. So yeah, like in the game that in the match that we were playing, they had nice spacious play area. Team Covenant did, but they had 3 pairs at each table. So you're sitting I was sitting almost as close as I am to you, to the person who was playing another pairing, right? And so we had the space in front of us for our game and our deck, and that was about it. And at one point I had my deck box on the table, but it was kind of obstructing the view of my opponent to my character and their life total. So I just moved that down to the floor, right? You don't want to be obstructing things for the other players.
Yeah, talking about the components, it reminds me a little bit too that in a lot of games, especially anything card related, you'll probably need to have sleeves. It'll be required.
Right.
Because you can't have any sort of markings on your cards, and you have to make sure everything's very uniform. So it's a good idea to bring extra sleeves with you too, just in case something gets torn, something gets spilled, who knows.
And you might even be like, listen, I don't mark my cards, this is perfectly fine, but sometimes your opponent might have questions or concerns about it. So just to put everyone's mind at ease, it's a good idea to just make sure things are sleeved. Sometimes too, they'll have requirements about letting your opponent cut your deck for you.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Do you know what I mean? Before, like after you shuffled, again, it's not so much a trust issue with you specifically, but just again to make sure everything's fair and balanced. In fact, one of the people I faced, I said to him, do you want to cut my deck? And he said yes. He said, actually, I will always cut my opponent's deck, not because I'm concerned about them, but I want to give them the permission to cut my deck. I don't want them to feel like, if he says, I'm not going to cut mine, then I feel weird asking him, to cut their deck, right? So I thought that was kind of a nice philosophy.
That's a good branching point into another topic too.
Yeah.
Like you said about being courteous and offering them to cut your deck. You should just be courteous in general when it comes to game. And
yeah, there's some manners and etiquette around a tournament, isn't there?
yeah, and some of them are rules based. Like for example, you usually would have to tell people how many cards are in your hand, or it's public knowledge. So constantly hiding your hand, maybe putting it under the table, might even break rules of the game.
Right.
So it's something to think about. And again, it's just generally being courteous. Like just because a rule says, you don't have to show your opponent X at all times. Like, your discard is open information, but, you don't have to constantly fan it out for them.
Right.
I mean, fanning it out for them is, I don't know, it's pretty courteous.
Yeah, in the tournament I was playing, it was meant to be somewhat casual, right? So there was different points where maybe I even made a little mistake, and my opponent would just point it out kindly and say, you can do this, or, don't forget X or Y or whatever it was I was supposed to do. It actually even helped me. And it was nice because it kind of set a tone, too, for how I felt about my opponent. You know what I mean? And I also kind of made a point of, like, if I noticed something a little out of whack, I'd maybe make mention of it as well. But it also is important to note that in a tournament setting, it's a little different than casually playing with your friends. There might be prizes on the line and such, so there might be rules about taking back something you've done. Like, once you do something, you might go, oops, I didn't mean to do that. And it might be up to the discretion of your opponent whether or not they're going to let you. And I think you kind of have to rein it in a little bit, even if you feel like, oh, come on, man. Like,
yeah, like the thing that you talked about is just those people were being, very nice about it. But I have been to tournaments where it's, things are on the line, whether it's prizes, like we're talking about winning something like 20 packs of cards,
right,
or an invitation to a tournament somewhere else.
Or they just simply paid a registration fee to come be in this tournament.
Yeah,
right?
So purposely letting you win is a little bit difficult for them, I imagine.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to think about that. You have to understand that they're here to win just as much as you are. So if you make a mistake, it's kind of their prerogative to punish you for it.
Right.
And if you make a mistake that breaks the rules, and that happened to me a couple times, and sometimes I feel bad for the fact that I broke the rule.
Yeah.
But other times I feel more annoyed at those people.
Oh, yeah? Like what?
I remember I was playing Magic one time, and a card had got removed from the game. And then whenever we went to play the next game, we noticed very much into that game, like I was about to win, and the other guy's like, hey, did you forget to shuffle that card back into your deck? And I'm like, oh, I did. And instantly his hand goes up and he's like, judge. And it's just like,
really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And again, I understand where he's coming from.
Yes.
Because that is something you can get a game loss for.
Right.
You didn't have the correct deck at the start of the game. But it's just kind of the tone and the attitude. And I also faced another guy who was the exact same thing happened.
Yeah.
But when it did, he was just kind of like, oh, like that kind of sucks. And I'm like, yeah, it does. It's like, do you want me to take the loss for it? And he's like, yeah, we're pretty high up in the tournament. I think I got it. And I'm like, that's cool. And
It was a
we
lot-
had a discussion. We
A
had
lot had to do with the
human-
approach, wasn't
Oh,
it?
yeah.
It really was, because that guy didn't have to throw his hand up and make a big scene about it. He could
Yeah.
still say, listen, you know what, I know this is a small thing, but this is kind of important to me. Can you appreciate maybe, I think we need to get a ruling on this or something? And that makes a big difference, I think, your whole attitude and approach. I mean,
Yeah, definitely.
a lot of the times these tournaments have disclaimers where they're saying, look, we're trying to grow a community here. The number one thing is being fair, being respectful of each other, being treated the way you'd want to be treated, and we all have something we can contribute in making sure that happens, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Now, I know one aspect you had wanted to mention here, and it really does kind of tie into the etiquette thing again. So many things really do tie into etiquette, when it comes to tournament play. But winning and losing and handling that in a tournament setting.
Oh yeah,
You
you
know?
gotta be a good winner, and you gotta be a good loser too. You don't want to be a sore loser. And like we said earlier with tiebreakers, sometimes losing isn't that bad. It might boost your tiebreakers for later anyway if you lose early on. A common approach to a tournament that you would go to, like again something like a Grand Prix, is if you lose a certain amount of games, you'll absolutely know that you can't reach top 8 or you can't get prizes.
Right,
A lot of
right.
people will actually drop out of the tournament, and I mean that's fine if you want to do that. But I mean, there's no harm in staying and playing either.
Yeah, it kind of suggests in some ways, again, not that it's absolutely wrong, but it kind of suggests you came there just to win, like
little
just to
bit.
get to the top or whatever. But it's nice if you can stay and play and see it as an experience again, to face other players and learn again what's working or not working with my strategies. You've probably paid, you've already invested some time, so why not, right?
Yeah.
I know in the games I was playing in this recent matchup, like it was always a handshake before or good luck or something, even before and after the matchup. Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah, it's a good idea, and clearly there's going to be people who don't like shaking hands. There's going to
Yes,
be people
yeah.
who don't like awkward social interaction. So you kind of have to read your opponent and the table that you're at, but
never
yeah.
hurts to be friendly at the very least.
Never
you know
hurts
what I
to be
mean?
friendly.
And congratulate someone on a win when they beat you. We keep thinking of new things that we want to say, and I think we could probably talk all day about this. One of the ones, though, going back to etiquette and manners again, when you finish your matchup and you're standing around, there's sometimes opportunities to observe other people's matchups.
And from a strategy standpoint, I suggest it.
Right.
Because you're allowed to go and watch other games usually. You might as well, because you can see what other kind of decks people
This
are
might be
playing.
a
if
future
it's
opponent you're going to be facing.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So it's a good idea.
But you do have to be careful how involved you get in somebody else's game. One of the matchups we had, there was a point where both me and my opponent were puzzling over what to do next. And we were doing some math out loud. We were actually talking to each other a little bit about, well, like if this happens, that happens, because we were being somewhat casual about our play. We'd lost a few matches, etc. But then someone who was observing chimed in and started also contributing to the strategizing.
Yeah.
And somebody else there said, hey man, you need to not get involved. Let them figure it out themselves. This
Yeah.
is their game. And I actually really appreciated that. I didn't think the guy was trying to, cause any problems for us, but it felt like someone outside of our bubble here was chiming in. And I didn't really appreciate that, honestly.
Yeah, you're not supposed to react or do anything. I mean, even if I stand behind you and I see your hand and I'm like, ho, 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 the guy across from me is your opponent.
Right.
He can see the faces that I'm making. And you have to be really careful. I actually had an example. I was at a regionals, and the top 8 was running, and one of the other guys from a top 8 game had finished his game very fast.
Okay.
And so he was standing behind somebody else that was also playing in the top 8. And when they drew their opening hand for that round, they said they made a comment,
Yeah.
like an actual comment. It was, there's a storm coming, and it was related to some of the cards in his hand had the name Storm in them.
Right.
And so the guy just turns around and he's like, "Did you really just do that?"
Yeah.
And instantly, he's just like, judge, and he got to restart that match, which was nice. But the other thing is that the guy who did it, he just got kicked out of the top 8. It's like,
Yeah.
well, you're done now.
It might seem harsh, but it kind of feels appropriate to me when I hear that. you
Yeah,
know?
and he said too, afterwards he apologized and he said, as soon as the words left my mouth,
realized.
I knew I shouldn't have done it.
Yeah,
And that's the thing, you kind of have to think ahead of time, because little comments and just
I'm really glad to hear.
"Woohoo."
I'm really glad to hear that was his reaction, because you hear the guy huffy, but it's nice that you recognize, hey, I made a mistake, and I don't want to affect somebody else's game.
Yeah.
You have a responsibility, right, when you're observing. I actually had another situation when I wrapped up one of my games. One of the people who had been observing the match said, hey, do you want to talk about what happened there and strategies that you employed and stuff? And I turned to him and said, no, not right now, actually. Because I just lost, and I wasn't feeling like having someone tell me, here's all the things you should have done differently. And then later on, I went and found that person, and we did chat about it, right? So that was fine. It was just, again, you got to be careful there. Also, I think intently staring at someone's hand can be a little intimidating when you're playing. Like if you're behind someone and you just have me standing around, you can see. That's one thing. To be kind of leaning over to see what they have, like I'm trying to play my game here. I'm not trying to play a game with you. So something else just to be kind of aware of, I think.
Yeah, if you can, try to be the neutral party. Don't support one side or the other.
Right. One thing to also keep in mind, I know I felt this way when I was facing this tournament, was it can be a little intimidating, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're going to be going to a place, probably a new place.
Yes.
Often full of strange people you've never met before.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of strangers.
Lots of strangers.
And strange people.
And I mean, maybe you're not completely confident in yourself or the deck that you've made, but the important thing to remember is 9 times out of 10, it's going to be something like a Swiss tournament.
Right.
So sure, you might get there, and the first game, this guy you're facing, he's just unstoppable. He just destroys you.
Right.
But then now it's a Swiss tournament, so you're only going to face other people who've lost their first game. So your next game, you're going to be facing pretty equal opponents likely.
Right.
And then if you happen to lose again, suddenly you're only facing people who've lost both their games.
Right.
And so it quickly puts you at a comfortable level. Like it's meant so that everyone's going to have a good time.
It also means as the tournament goes on, the people you're facing with, there's something kind of relatable. Like,
Yeah.
I'm sitting down with someone else who also lost 3 times in a row. We kind of have a little joke with that. And let's see how this time it fares or whatever, right?
Yeah, that's always a great opening is like, so how did you lose your last couple games?
Exactly.
Like, what are the other guys playing?
And despite the fact that a tournament can be intimidating, there are things you can do to prepare. So it's not as intimidating. For example, I mean, this is basic, but you can practice. Like,
Oh, yeah.
you can practice some matches with some friends outside of the tournament setting. You can go online. You can sometimes see other popular decks, so you have a sense of, what you're going to be facing. So it's not a complete surprise when someone starts dropping all these combinations on you that you weren't expecting.
And it's not a bad idea to go and find a deck online that you think looks good or powerful and use that deck.
Right.
I mean, you can make your own, and you can do well with your own deck. But sometimes it's much easier to jump into a new setting, a new tournament, by actually just copying something you saw online.
And be open to advice. Like the day before the tournament started, when I was there at that Ashes event, I, again, wasn't planning to be in the tournament. Once I realized I was going to be in the tournament, I just sat down and started playing game after game after game, right?
Yeah.
And I started with a deck that was barely legal. And then I played, and I saw some weaknesses, made some adjustments, played against better players. I listened to their advice. They offered suggestions. I wasn't defensive about it. I listened to what they had to say. I made some adjustments. And by the end of it, when it was actually time to start the tournament, I knew I wasn't going to win the tournament, but I felt like I knew how my deck worked. I felt confident about the sort of things I might see, and I felt good about the way it played. Win or lose, I liked what it was doing, and that was just its own kind of, moral victory, I guess, in each of the matches that I had.
Yeah, and something to touch on you said too about knowing how it's played. If you ever have any sort of questions about exactly how something in your deck interacts with something else, look it up ahead of time.
Oh yeah, that's a good
because
point.
it's so much easier. Your opponent might not believe you. You might need to call a judge anyway,
Yeah.
but it's so much easier when you know the answer yourself.
Sometimes in casual play with your friends, you just sort of interpreted a rule a certain way. And then you find out, no, the timing's actually a little different, like
Yeah.
officially, and so it's good to sort that out as well.
What about you? Have you attended any tournaments? Maybe have some advice for new attendees? Any great stories?
Or horror stories? I'm sure there's some out there. Let us know about them. Put them in the comments below. Or if you want, you can record a short, very brief 1 to 2 minute video. Send me a link to a Dropbox or Google Drive, and we'll share that in next week's Table Talk Back and see what everyone has to say. But until then, thanks for watching. There's things that can happen to make it's cold. It's cold out here, man.
It is cold.
It's so cold.
I said we should take a break, and you're like,
no.
no.
3, 2, 1.
What do you think?
Perfect take. Thanks for watching.
What do you think? Have you attended any tournaments?
I've already told you what I think.
Shut up! What about you? Have you attended any... What about you?
What about you?
Me too.
I don't know why it's just hitting me funny.
Okay.
What about you?
What about you? Do you...
I don't know. There's something sing-songy about it. What about you?
What about you? Have you attended any tournaments recently?
Have any tips to share?
What about you? Have you attended any tournaments lately? Maybe have some tips for attendees? What the hell, man?
Okay.
What about you? Have you attended any tournaments? Any advice for future attendees?
I'm sorry.